Good afternoon, everyone. Perspective, word choices, and context. As we learned during the last 3 days, the individuals selected to be jurors are very different, with vastly different opinions and experiences. And that is a good thing. And as you begin to hear information and these allegations, the one thing the system of American justice requires is for you to take everything in. You should remain curious, demand answers to questions that you may have, want to know as much about the circumstances as possible, pay special note as testimony and evidence comes in as to what the prosecutors leave out and don't tell you, who they do not call, what doctors they do not call, what information they don't give you about the Solanders, and Mrs. Solander in particular, the children, their history before they ever came into contact with the Solander family, and Miss Solander's history. All of that is important in a case like this. And as the witnesses come out and documents come out one after another, we ask you to take notes and take note how that information is presented and how that is really part of narratives. Perspective, word choices, and context. Now, what I'm asking you to look for as the evidence comes in is not very different on how you should watch the news or evaluate any story that any child or person gives you. For instance, the same set of facts, uncontrovertible facts, presented on, say, Fox News may...
I'm going to object. This is supposed to be what the evidence is going to show.
Well, overruled.
Thank you.
But be careful not seeing argument.
Versus what is presented on CNN may serve very different purposes. You have to watch out as you receive the information as to what is verified and what is not, what is innuendo and what is truth. And understand, as you hear the evidence, there are advocates who are inclined to believe criminal child abuse from the allegation, and they may offer their expert opinion based on their perspective.
I'm going to object again.
This is the context of Dr. Settle testifying.
All right, overruled.
Thank you.
I don't think it's argument at this point.
It's about how you perceive the information and trying to get information to you without burying. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what we want you to look for. The prosecutors choose their words, and as you hear the evidence, you will hear those words. Punishment, anger, rage, victim, abuse, beaten. You heard it in the opening statement. Why not use the word structure, accusations, concern, good intentions, corrective efforts? I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the narrative, the word choices are a product of a narrative that assumes the worst in people and will give no context to who Janet Solander is and why she did any of the things that she actually did. Which begs the question, when you come to those witnesses and perceive those witnesses, are you a person who looks for evil as an explanation, or are you a person who comes from a place of compassion, understanding, and a desire to learn all of the circumstances? To do as the American justice system requires, which is to presume throughout the receipt of evidence that any conduct you believe Mrs. Solander committed was not criminal abuse. And that's what I say when I say perspective, word choices, and context as we move through this case together. This is old school PowerPoint. Now, from the onset, I want to go a little out of order and confidently say that you will hear no credible evidence that supports the wild allegation from the adopted Solander children that there was sexual assault. That will be a distraction from the more important business at hand. You will see from the evidence that it has no place in these proceedings, that it simply did not happen, and more than that, it's a word choice. You may have preconceived notions when the prosecutor decided to level a charge of sexual assault against Mrs. Solander, and it probably was a huge shock to learn in the prosecutor's opening statement that the so-called sexual assault was the alleged medical insertion of a catheter on a youngster who was allegedly intentionally withholding urine. So it's word choices, narrative. These are the things we want you to pay special attention to when you hear the testimony of the witnesses and the questions of all counsel. Indeed, and it bears repeating, the presumption of innocence means that the allegation of inserting a catheter is presumed not to happen until or unless the prosecution proves that to you beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense can't prove a negative, nor does the law require the defense to do so. But we can, and we point out during these proceedings, that the false allegation does not have sufficient corroboration or proof. And that holds equally true for the catheters as the outrageous allegation that a pain stick was placed in one of the girl's vagina at one point. So let's go back and start from the start and tell you more about this case than the prosecutors did in the opening. First off, fancy PowerPoint from the government. They can't.
Objection, argumentative.
It was not a fancy PowerPoint.
All right.
And they don't have a single slide about who Janet Solander is, but plenty of innuendo. Did they tell you about her upbringing on military bases?
Judge, I'm going to object and ask to approve.
All right.
In the Army, where she served as an EMT and then as a medical tech. You will hear during the course of this trial that she was a nursing assistant for the Department of Defense for many years. These are public records that could be checked. You will hear about Ms. Solander's mother's death when Janet was 12 years of age from diabetes and her own health problems, including a diagnosis of diabetes and Van Willebrand's disease, which is progressive thyroid disorder. And this information is important, not because we're asking to engender sympathy, but because it paints a picture of a person who developed into a loving, caring parent who knew the value and the importance of taking kids to doctors, to test them early, to figure out what's going on medically or psychologically, if anything, and equally eliminating possible medical concerns. You will hear that Mrs. Solander had no issue raising her 4 biological children. That there were no allegations of abuse in any way, that it is not her style. Indeed, I think that we have to concede at this point that all the evidence will show that Janet Solander is a perfect candidate for foster care and went through all of the vetting. And as a foster parent, the Department of Family Services, DFS, and Child Protective Services, CPS, were necessarily involved and evaluated things and did not tell the Solanders that the things that the prosecution is now saying are criminal were in any way wrong. That the government, same government, went into that house, saw things, and didn't say this is criminally liable, but found that allegations were unsubstantiated and found that the techniques, while maybe not orthodox, were not crossing the line into criminal behavior, because they all have an obligation to do that. And the Solanders have a right to rely on those interactions for what's reasonable. Indeed, the Solanders were trained and appropriate and had an appropriate home that had many visitors, including mandatory reporters in the home who endorsed what the Solanders were doing by failing to say in any way that they needed to stop doing it And the proof, ladies and gentlemen, is not only did the Department of Family Services keep giving kids to the Solanders, but they encouraged the Solanders to adopt Ava, Amaya, Anastasia. They encouraged them to do it at the quickest point that they could. Heck, the state reimbursed the Solanders for the adoption proceedings. When you look at the charging document, it says that all this abuse began on January 19, 2011, the date of the adoption. You saw a picture. So they're saying that the picture that you were shown of the smiling children at the adoption proceeding, that day, this horrific, terrible torture that never stopped for the next 2.5 years started. That day. They're just waiting. That's the narrative. But the evidence will show that Janet Solander did not somehow snap that day on the day of the adoption. That her 50-some-odd years on earth at that point, as a thoughtful, gentle, loving, caring, involved, concerned person, did not end the second the judge signed the piece of paper giving them the adoption. Look at that amended information. You'll see that day is when they're alleging this occurred. The prosecutor suggests in their opening that Janet was just waiting for the second that DFS was not directly involved to do what? Torture these kids, be a completely different person out of the blue. The evidence will not support that. When you receive the evidence, presumably, the question will arise. How does it make sense that an abuser is making all these strides to help these kids in such an open way? That this alleged abuser is making sure all the kids are okay while she's out of town, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is when that nanny came in for the 3-week period. Janet Solander wasn't even there. She had to go care for sick relatives out of town, and she wanted to make sure that Dwight had help. And Dwight gave whatever instructions the nanny is going to talk about, not Janet. It came from Dwight. That's the abuser. That's consistent with the abuser to make sure that the kids are taken care of. The evidence will show that all the doctor's visits, all the exposure to these mandatory reporters is the absolute opposite of a pattern of abuse. To give full context, I want to say that abuse is happening. Shouldn't you hear from every doctor who touched these kids during this alleged period of time in the information? And I don't know who the prosecution's going to call, but names to look for, starting in January 19, 2011, are medical staff at Centennial Hills Hospital where Amaya was taken. Medical personnel at Desert Valley Pediatrics where Anastasia was taken. Medical personnel at Summerlin Hospital where Ava was taken. And we're not even out of the first 2 months from the adoption. And this is going to go on all the way through the end of the allegation period in the complaint of November of 2013. Will we hear from Dr. Duan, who looked at Anastasia? Will we hear from Dr. Bernstein, who saw Ava? The Summerlin Hospital, who saw Ava? Will we hear from Dr. Nyarko, N-Y-A-R-K-O, at the Children's Specialty Center, who saw Ava and who noted in his notes, positive for Crohn's markers? Will we hear from that doctor from the state giving you all the information? Will we hear from the hospital personnel who looked at Ava about inflammation in June of 2011? Will we hear about all the unannounced home visits, the crossover, when DFS personnel were in the home consistent with when the foster kids were there, looking around, seeing things? We're not even out of 2011 yet. Will we hear from Dr. Maletti or Dr. Sheik? Will we hear from Monte Vista Hospital? Will we hear from any of these people who are all going to admit to you that they are mandatory reporters? And that none of these individuals personally or felt that there was any reason to suggest that there was abuse in the household. Dehydration from lack of appropriate amount of liquid would be a pretty easy thing to spot and an anomaly that would require a mandatory report or further inquiry. The evidence will show that the Solanders incurred personal expense to ensure insurance, necessities, and ultimately the behavioral school that you heard about to help these 3 challenged children. And you also hear that there was no concern as to the physical well-being of these children at any time related to anything that the Solanders actually did. I heard the expression every single day. The suggestion to you that the evidence will support that every single day these kids went through something horrific. You will look at evidence that they were doing their homework, that they were getting rewards, that they left the house, that they went to different places. They were fed, they were nourished, they were healthy, except for the things that they weren't. And that brings us to Ava, Amaya, and Anastasia. What have you heard about what the evidence will show about their challenges before they came to the Solander home in 2010? 94 slides. What did you write down in your notes about what the Solander kids went through before they ever came to the Solander house? I think everyone here knows the answer is 0. But that information is going to have to come out. The evidence will show that these children suffered actual abuse of a sort in excess of what's accused here today. Molestation, neglect, and worse. And as a result, they came to the Solander house with issues. And there were 3 of them siblings. It's not easy to find somebody who's willing to take on challenged kids who've been through it, documented, substantiated, removed, let alone someone who's willing to take into their home multiple sisters who not only have whatever the familial and the sister bond would be, but who've also all suffered from these challenges, taken away from their biological families because of the molestation, the abuse, and the other neglect. That's where these Solander kids came in. Now you're going to hear from a paid child abuse advocate who is a medical doctor, but spends a lot of time just testifying cases, who brings her own context, perspective, and word choices. If she's being candid and consistent with the way that she's testified for money in other cases, she will say that children who suffer these type of abuses, these type of things like molestation, have significant behavioral issues. And that it could be escalated and elevated given the family dynamic situation with the other sisters. And that it is exacerbated moving from place to place before they go into a settled location. That they're always uneasy, always uncertain, very resistant, always acting out. Engaged in many behavioral deficits, like bedwetting and defecation issues, and even doing that stuff on purpose, acting out on purpose, making false accusations on purpose. And you will have evidence that false accusations are made by one or more of those Solander kids, admittedly, that have nothing to do with Solanders. That teachers hit them, that other things happen. You will hear of them acting out in situations that had nothing to do with the Solanders. They don't want structure. You will hear they don't want discipline. They're little kids who have been through a whole lot. And we all have empathy for them. And they came into the Solander house challenged. And the Solanders had to meet that challenge. Now, when they came in with the behavioral issues, potentially medical issues, and medical issues need to be ruled out. And the responsibility to do that is not with DFS, but that's with the Solanders. It's on the Solanders. The Solanders become adoptive parents, they become parents. And they do that by choice. And they have to rule out medical things. And if anything is happening, they want to go get that information, get that advice. Now, that's about context, that's about perspective, that's my narrative. And it's very different how we look at taking children to doctors. It can be viewed from an evil standpoint, or it can be viewed from a standpoint of compassion and understanding. Same facts. No one's going to dispute all the doctor's visits. There was discipline. There was great concern. There were good intentions to help these girls. Now certainly, based on what is anticipated from the children, they will wildly exaggerate the decisions by Mrs. Solander and Mr. Solander. And with the professional witness of the state, the paid witness by the state, they will suggest to you that the exaggerations are possible. But you will never hear from any degree of medical certainty that they happen. And listen for that very carefully. That's the scrutiny that the individuals who are selected for this jury are tasked with, is to listen to the language choices and the word choices. Will Dr. Settle, the paid expert from the state, ever say definitively the injuries that I saw on those children are consistent with the allegations, or will the doctor say they absolutely occurred to a degree of medical certainty by those allegations? I would suggest to you, if Dr. Settle is consistent with testimony that we've looked at from other things, she'll say it is consistent. What's that? Consistent. Well, could it also be inconsistent with? Well, yes, of course. It's words coming from a child abuse advocate whose position is to believe everything and not to go and disprove things. That's not her job, and I don't begrudge her that. It's your job to scrutinize it. And when Dr. Settle will be asked about the age of some of the things that were pointed out to you in the photos and other photos that you'll see a lot of photos. The state's going to introduce lots and lots of photos to you. The age of some of these things. Dr. Settle is, well, it's consistent with something that could have been during that time frame, or maybe before. Because you're going to know very scant about what those kids went through before. I would suggest by design. Now, understand, the defense has its limitations. We can only do so much, but we also don't have the burden. The prosecution has the burden, and remember that as you receive the evidence. So, there's bathroom, peeing, defecation issues. To be expected with children from horrible situations who are displaced, who are moved around, who maybe don't want to have structure in their lives. Too much, wrong times, wrong places, sometimes they're withholding, sometimes they're doing it too much. The entire spectrum of issues and acting out, and all of which people who are in the Solander's position have to do the best that they can. Because they know that this behavior and these actions provide a risk to the children if allowed to continue without intervention. How nice it would be to take a challenged or damaged child who's 7 years old or 9 years old and explain to them the error of their ways and hope that they'll stop doing the things that they do. Stop the tantrums, stop the self-hurt, stop withholding urine and getting UTIs or urinary tract infections, stop having stomach issues, stop acting out, stop throwing things, stop lashing out. It'd be nice if you could just convince them to do that. But these aren't kids who came from a loving base one. So Janet and Dwight at different times used all of the techniques that are legally available. Foremost, doctors. Not a bad thing, a good thing, as the evidence will show. This will make sense to you. Questions are raised about the children. Is there something physiologically wrong that is causing some of this? Can it be ruled out? Can it be identified? Janet has some experiences. She has raised a number of kids. She has had a lot of foster kids come through. No mention of them before the Solander kids come into their lives. And she knows that some things warrant further attention and some things need intervention, and she does that. If they're acting up, if they're throwing tantrums, if they're possibly not eating healthy at school, if they aren't doing their homework, if they're being combative, if they're intentionally urinating and defecating on themselves, what would any reasonable parent do? Try to curb it, and that's what the evidence will show they did. That they did institute timeouts. Now, in retrospect, the prosecution is going to suggest or present evidence that these were for extended period of times, which make it criminal. I mean, they're doing timeouts. It's not physical. There is structured bathroom time. There are loss of privileges. You've got 7, 8, 9 kids at a time, many of whom are damaged, all of whom have some manner of bathroom issue or acting out, etc. Doling out 80 sheets of toilet paper a night seems, in that context, not to be so unreasonable. And it's certainly not accused of child abuse, but it keeps being brought up. Allowing corporal punishment with a light implement is clearly allowed. Threats. You'll hear evidence of threats. Things that are not as bad and some that are worse than some of the things that we talked about during jury selection. You'll hear all that. And when none of it worked, after trying everything at their own expense, they paid for a top behavioral school with a religious component where the girls were for 3 months without incident. Except, you'll hear from the director that they have behavioral issues and that they were working at curbing. So Janet knew at that point that it was time to put them in a professional setting, because she's not, you will hear evidence, she didn't put them at this behavioral school because she's evil or mean. You'll hear evidence that she did it because she is caring, and she wanted the best for those kids and give them a chance to function in society, to stay in a adoptive and not age out of the system, to not have red marks of unplaceable, but to have a chance to adjust from the abuse that they had previously suffered and function with each other and in society in the correct way. None of the things, and plenty of people talk to those kids, resulted in any charges or any substantiated investigation at all. That is until Nevada CPS called Florida CPS, and then, and only then, for the first time, do we start to get the seeds, but not all of, the allegations that are presented in the charging document. The allegations that the prosecutor talked to you about with the confidence of personal knowledge, but obviously is relying upon the exaggerations of the children and assuming them to be true. That's how that works. And I just want to throw another little thing out. That this case, as we're standing here today, really starts to come to fore also after the discovery that Mrs. Solander is published a book criticizing the CPS and the DFS of Nevada. More on that in a second. In that first disclosure to Florida CPS, I'm going to tell you there wasn't a single mention of catheters. That developed in the story from the girls. The girls who are now older, who are being given structure, who have been taken away from their family surroundings, who were in an accredited but Bible study structured behavioral school, were now approached and asked, tell us about your life at the Solander house. And this isn't until 2014, 3 months after the last allegation in that criminal charging document. And we suggest, as you receive the evidence, that you look at the motivation of the Solander girls for exaggeration, for manipulating the system that they had become, unfortunately, aware of, to take the allowed conduct that CPS had no problem with and bump it up into the allegations which are now in front of you. And even those allegations, you will hear from the evidence, do not amount to criminal conduct. And remember that as you're evaluating the evidence. And that's the context, the word choice, and the perspective that we ask each of you to have in mind as you listen to what is being presented to you. There is no evidence of criminal level abuse or neglect in the Solander household at any time before November 11, 2013. There are no mandatory reporters who made any legitimate or substantiated report, no credible findings of abuse, no documentation of anything amounting to criminal level abuse. Indeed, as stated, the CPS and DFS were in that household, and not just them. Because you have foster kids in your house, there are also therapists and other personnel that are required to be in and out of that house all the time. Saw buckets, maybe they saw paint sticks. They asked questions, they got answers. None of them required the Solanders to change their methods. Now, that's it about the Solander. I'm going to take a slight detour to talk about Lori Wells, the intern. Intern. I don't know if that was mentioned. Lori Wells had no interaction with the Solander kids. Zero. Lori Wells is an intern who was assigned to the Diaz-Burnett kids. I want you to read that document and tell me where the word Diaz or Burnett or Stark shows up one time in that information. You will hear no evidence that Janet Solander has been charged with any offense related to those people, to those children. None. Zero. 4 years now. Nothing. But it's being presented to you, so I have to talk about how it's to be perceived, what the context of that is, and the word choices that are being used. The defense is not going to introduce evidence to you of these poor little girls who also came from broken homes, who came from products of gross neglect, deprivation, molestation, sexual abuse. It starts with the Diaz-Burnett kids too, who had documented medical problems. No, we're forced to bring that information to you about something that's not even charged in this case, because that information has now been presented to you as somehow being relevant to these proceedings.
Objection, argument.
That's sustained.
So, I don't know how many slides were devoted to people who aren't in this information, but when they come in, we're going to hear about Lori Wells, the intern. Lori Wells, the intern who was removed from the case of Diaz-Burnett, who's no longer working in that capacity, who hasn't really advanced in her career, who didn't have the proper training to suggest anything, who had no bearing or
Objection, argument.
you will hear no evidence.
Objection, argument.
Okay, Mr. Figler can say what the evidence will show.
Or what the evidence will not show.
In terms of what her career progression has been.
She has her opinions. God bless, we all do. But you will hear no evidence that she had anything to do with the Solander kids, or that her opinion is valid, or that it did really anything with regard to your job of determining whether or not the state is proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Criminal level abuse. And you'll also hear her lack of qualification for making opinions and her overreaching. And again, you will hear about her removal, not because the Solanders had that power. They're not powerful people. But because you'll hear why. So now these allegations are out there. The kids have been interviewed not once, but multiple times, and circumstances aren't really well documented. But police officers who had the ability to do further investigation, to try to find proof of stuff, and so, you know, that's their job. That's a police officer's job. So what do? They ask for a search warrant. Okay. So they did a search. What did they find? The buckets. How about blood? Nope. No blood. Paint sticks. Yep, they found the paint sticks. How about broken paint sticks? Because there's this wild allegation that they hit them so hard it broke the paint sticks. You imagine you find one broken paint stick. Nope. Blood was everywhere. We bled. That's the allegation you're going to hear. Everyone saw blood. Not only no blood, but no biological material on any of the paint sticks, on anything, anywhere, tables, walls. They don't find that. They don't find blood. They don't find DNA that would come from a paint stick going into somebody. Come on. No blood on tables, no blood on the stairs, no blood anywhere. No cages, as described by the children, but what you saw, safety fences. No multiple boards set up to be sleeping quarters. There was a board on the floor on one of those, but cots. And you will not hear any evidence that sleeping on a cot is child abuse, but that's what's alleged. Normal fans that you saw, not industrial torture fans from some crazy movie, you'll not hear any of that. And then the book. How to Fix the Corrupted System of Foster Care by Janet Solander. You will hear cross-examination of the detective and ask, why are you so interested in that book all of a sudden? Why did you put that book in the search warrant? What were you looking for? And why did you take every copy you could find of the book? And why did you take all the documents between Janet and her publisher, and all her edit notes, and how much she was paid for the book, and how much work and effort was made into her research, and all the research for that book? Why are you focused on that? Why are you obsessed on that when there's a charge of child abuse? Why is CPS all of a sudden now going in there and taking pictures of that book, which was available online? They took into evidence every copy they could find, reams of records regarding her contract with the publisher. You'll see a giant folder that's in this courtroom right now that has all these papers about a publisher and research. The evidence will show that the government seems to be obsessed with this book and its accusation of flaws in the system and discrediting Janet. You saw one excerpt pulled out from an introduction with an ellipse in it, ellipse, the dot, dot, dot. Ellipse. There's a lot of words in that book. We both feel that it was divine intervention on behalf of these children that they were placed with us. may sound conceited, but we've always felt that the behaviors these children have displayed could otherwise have resulted in multiple failed adoption attempts until they turned out of the system, or they would have been placed in a family that didn't have tolerance and patience that we do, and they would have ended up a statistic. We've been foster parents for close to 4 years as of the beginning of 2013, and we have fostered over 20 children in that time, most of them long-term, more than 6 months. We adopted our 3 girls after fostering them. We also are active in advocating for reform in the way CPS cases are handled, in the way the court system ignores statutes and considers the rights of biological parents over the welfare of these children in too many cases. Now, if you read the book, and presumably it's going to be introduced to you as I have, it's a book that lays out the frustrations, but the need to do everything you can do to help children. That is the place of the context behind the actions, and how the system doesn't necessarily support parents to do that, especially with challenged children with significant behavioral issues. It is a stinging indictment, and it appears to be part of the reason why this is even happening, this prosecution, the overwhelming evidence that the police and the DFS focus on this book more than the welfare of anything. At the end, you personally may not agree with the hard parenting decisions that Janet herself made, but you will hopefully come to understand that they came from a good place. The exaggeration of some of these decisions is unfortunate. As we stated, the jury, you, each individual here, is the safeguard. Understandably, child abuse advocates are trained to believe everything and not look behind the allegations. You'll hear from those folks, the police, the government. See if they, when you receive that evidence, try to run down what is true, what is false, or even what is exaggerated. Now, that's going to be your first job as you receive the evidence. Did it happen the way the children claim exactly? Or is there a possibility based on the evidence that it happened less intensely or not at all? That's job 1. Job 2, even if you think some of these allegations happen the way described, and that will not be the case, but even if you do, was it actual criminal conduct beyond a reasonable doubt, as you'll be instructed at the end? And we suggest at the end of receipt of evidence and at the end of your deliberations, the answer has to be no by following the law. No. The evidence will show that discipline and structure were part of the Solander household, and that the Solander children presented unique challenges, and that naturally the children resisted and eventually found an out. And that out was the exaggeration and the exaggerated reports. At the end of the evidence, you should have no hesitation in separating these uncharged, contextually misappropriate conversations or dialogue about the Diaz-Burnett kids and the Stark kids and what's actually being charged in our document. Because that's your task. Just focusing on that. The court will instruct you as to that as well. And at the end of the evidence, you should have no hesitation in finding that the government has not met any burden and return a verdict of not guilty so that Mrs. Solander can get back to her life. Thank you.